Let's move on, Tim, to rock hardish.
Yeah.
So we've thrown a few things in here that we're not quite sure how heavy they are. But anyway, another fantastic year for another form of rock music, hard rock. And
Yeah.
let's just go through some of these very quickly, and then we can go back and talk about some of them. Deep Purple, Machine Head, and Made in Japan. So arguably the band's commercial and artistic zenith. Wishbone Ash, Argus, definitely the band's peak. Black Sabbath Vol.4, Hawkwind, Doremi, Fasol, Latido, Status Quo, Piledriver, Thin Lizzy, Shades of a Blue, Orphanage, Alice Cooper, School's Out. Let's go and talk about some of these, Tim. So first of all, I don't know if have we talked about Deep Purple on the show before?
I think we've discussed them occasionally because I really like the very early Rod Evans-led version of the band, and
But we
you're
haven't
not as
talked.
keen.
We haven't talked about. No, I'm not so keen. We haven't talked about vintage Purple, have we?
We have only done it in passing.
I think we might have mentioned before that we both think Fireball is our favourite album.
Yeah, great album.
Even though we haven't. Have we done 1971? I don't think we have.
No, we haven't.
Anyway, but we've mentioned it in passing. But definitely, I mean, in terms of live albums, this is the definitive double 70s live album, and perhaps started a trend in live albums, double live albums that continued throughout the decade, for better and worse, it must be said. Some great live double albums. But maybe this is an example of a band that could only really capture everything they were about by recording a live performance. Ritchie Blackmore, so flamboyant, so unpredictable, almost feels like he's too tethered in the studio. And I think there's a sense of that in the band generally too. So Made in Japan kind of features the whole of the Machine Head album. But I think all bar one track they play, or maybe a couple of tracks they play on Made in Japan. And without exception, the versions live on Made in Japan all smoke the studio versions.
Well, I think the thing is that they're another band where every single member is great at what they do, and they make a great collective sound. And I think you're right that while it doesn't reference fusion or jazz rock, like Zeppelin, they've got a kind of tight but loose, groovy quality that you can relate to funk or jazz or even chaos coming together. They seem to sort of mess around, but always in a way that comes together in a powerful way.
Almost telepathic. Yeah. I mean, I think this is going back to the Stones thing. I think the Stones have that too. It's almost shambolic, but somehow there's a telepathic connection that just makes this gestalt thing that just sounds like Deep Purple. And of course, a lot of that is the interplay between John Lord on the organ and Ritchie Blackmore on the guitar. But like you say, what a rhythm section.
Ian
Pacey on the drums.
Glover is great.
Incredible drummer. And of course, they have
Gillan is a great
their
frontman.
best vocalist, I think. You know, I know people love Dave Coverdale. Always a slightly odd, slightly out of place.
Though Byrne is a classic.
I think he's a brilliant vocalist, but I think he was always slightly out of place in Deep Purple. It's not my favorite. This is the lineup everybody talks about when they talk about Purple. Not everybody, but most people come back to this lineup.
Well, I think, you know, this is a period of hard rock that I really like and can kind of sort of understand, because I think, you know, some of these were kind of session players in the 60s, as of course was Jimmy Page, John Paul Jones. So they drew on a lot of different influences from rock, pop, soul, rock and roll, and so on very naturally. They were just great, as you said, intuitive players, and they'd found a group that matched each other as well, you know.
And they toured for years together, and they'd made 3 albums. I know you like them, but I think they made 3 albums where they were just finding themselves.
Yeah.
And suddenly they arrive in rock, 1970. They've got the sort of archetype of the Deep Purple sound. And this is kind of the peak now of it, Machine Head, Made in Japan. But it's almost, it's interesting you mentioned they're able to draw on all these little things. I wonder if part of that is because certainly Ritchie Blackmore spent years as a session player.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying,
Yeah. So he's got all of this in his vocabulary. So he can pull a little country lick out of the air.
Yeah.
He can pull a little sort of, you know, pop. He's done a Petula Clark session the week before. He can pull that out of the air.
Yeah.
And it all comes into play, and it's kind of all integrated into his solo style.
Completely.
Kind of all these little phrases, and you think, where does that come from? And it just sounds like Ritchie Blackmore.
Well, I think the thing is, what's great about the progressive and hard rock music of this era is it's not ossified into cliche.
No.
So at this point, it's just a great band making great music and defining the territory. By the end of the decade, hard rock, heavy metal, it's a style.
I think you're absolutely right, because the three biggest bands of certainly the first half of the 70s, the biggest rock bands, Zeppelin, Purple, Sabbath, could not be more different
No.
from each other. And it's funny because in modern day rock bands, you can hear which band they've been influenced by the most. That's the Sabbath influence. That's the Zeppelin influence. Zeppelin obviously were always a little bit more pentatonic, the sort of blues scale. Sabbath had the sort of devil's intervals. Deep Purple somewhere in the middle, but I think obviously the differentiating factor here is the keyboard.
Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah,
which rocks as hard as the guitar in this band. That fantastic, and the tones. I mean, Blackmore's tone on the guitar, John Lord's sound, Pacey's sound on the drums. It's just all working at 100% in this year, 1972, particularly on the Made in Japan record.
Yeah, and I think the interesting thing is that with especially Purple and Zeppelin, they could have become anything they wanted, and they could have become a symphonic progressive rock band if they'd wanted.
Well, Led Zeppelin almost did on some tracks.
Yeah, and they could have become a funk band if
Led Zeppelin almost did on some tracks.
A great pop rock band. I mean, Black Knight, what a great single as well. I know this precedes this, but these bands were just kind of firing off ideas. Not as many ideas as Roxy Music on Roxy Music, but they had a lot to draw on.
Wishbone Ash Argus. I mentioned when I was listening at some of these that it's kind of the album that they reached a peak on. It's such a peak in their catalogue. I mean, I like Wishbone Ash. I like the first album very much, but this album is. There are some bands where they have a whole catalogue, and one album clearly. We talked about Nick Drake. You can't pick between those three albums.
Yeah.
Zeppelin. It's very hard. For me anyway.
Yeah.
Very hard for me to pick. Is it Presence? Is it Physical Graffiti? Is it Has the Holy? Is it Four? Is it Three? They're all brilliant. Sabbath. Is it the first album? Is it Paranoid? Is it Wishbone Ash, Argus? And it's very hard to find anybody that doesn't think that's clearly. So
I like Just Testing.
I quite like some of the other albums. There's the Rub is a good record. The first album is good. But Argus is their masterpiece, and very clearly their masterpiece. It's interesting, isn't it? Because this is a band that have got a little bit, perhaps, of what we were talking about, the English folk tradition in their music as well. Pastoral acoustic guitars in their music. But they're also pioneering the twin guitar thing, aren't they? So whereas all of the other bands had a single guitar player that kind of defines their sound, Jimmy Page in Led Zeppelin, Ritchie Blackmore in Deep Purple, Tony Iommi in Black Sabbath, here the sound of the band is defined by the way the two guitar players interact. This is the beginning of the kind of twin lead thing. Then Lizzy also made an album this year out of interest, but long before they had two guitar players.
Well, I think with Argus, it's got the anti-Love Beach effect in the sense
that... The anti-Love Beach effect? Yeah. I'm curious about what that is. Okay.
Well, the Love Beach, that cover, no matter what album was in that cover, was going to be doomed for eternity. Whereas actually Argus, what an amazing sleeve. This is, again, like Bare Trees, one of the sleeves of the year.
Yes.
And it's almost like anything that's in that automatically has a sense of mystique because of the great Hypnosis, I think it was, artwork.
You say that, Tim, but I can think of lots of albums that we love and that lots of people love that have terrible covers.
Oh, it is true. Blue Nile Hats.
Sounds.
Blue Nile Hats, Pet Sounds. I'm going with you.
Tarkus.
What a cover. And what is curious about this album is that whereas a lot of artists are kind of, you say probably the twin guitar is the one thing that hints at certain futures for music, but generally speaking, I'm hearing a big influence from Peter Green's Fleetwood Mac. I think there's a really strong early Fleetwood Mac influence, and I think there's a Fairport Convention influence.
Yeah, for sure.
And it's almost like a hybrid of kind of folk rock, blues rock, and forming it into something, for whatever reason with this album, partly due to the cover I'm putting it down to as well, partly due to tracks like King Will Come, where they do build a mystique with the sort of slow build music. It's their definitive statement.
Did they suffer
There's almost an enigma attached to it.
Did they suffer a bit by not having a great vocalist? The vocals are fine, aren't they? But they're fine. To me, I think that they're just fine.
I think they serve the purpose.
They serve the purpose, yeah.
Whereas even going on to Bare Trees, if they'd have had Danny Kerwin, this might have notched up 2 or 3 levels higher.
Yeah.
And that's not to criticise the singing, because it's all sweet. It does the job. It's all
really
good.
Like it.
And obviously the guitar playing, there's a beautiful sound to the guitars. I mean, that's the thing that some of this album sounds very pristine and again quite sparse. They're not afraid of space.
No, it's very
in
organic.
The music.
No, it's very organic. They played it live pretty much the way they performed it in the studio. At least the tracks they played live. I mean, they played Blowin' Free, I think, at every single gig they ever did after this. No.
But yeah, had they had Danny Kawan or Lindsay McVie on vocals,
Lindsay McVie,
it might have been a different thing altogether.
Everyone could have benefited from having Lindsay McVie on vocals.
Well, I think so, yeah.
Yeah. Sabs, Black Sabbath Volume 4. What's your favourite Black Sabbath album? It's hard, isn't it? Because it's like...
I know what mine is.
I bet I know too.
Go on.
Sabotage.
Sabotage.
I knew it would be. It's the most prog rock.
Is it?
Of course, completely. 2 10-minute long tracks. No, I
like Technical Ecstasy and Never Say Die as well. Underrated.
I love also very proggy. I love Sabotage. For me, the first album.
I love the first album.
It's so... Well, it's the archetype for so much, isn't it? Including their own career.
And Paranoid. I think the first two albums have, as we know, they've got that kind of loose, organic feel that is in Deep Purple and Led Zeppelin, but completely different because the harmonies, as you say, very different. The chords, perhaps even the simplicity of the music as well with Black Sabbath, and obviously their lyrical themes. But I really like that first album in particular, and I think Paranoid takes a couple of those ideas further. You can hear that they're actually steeped in experimental psychedelia as much as anything, actually, with Sabbath at times.
Can you? I'm not sure I hear that. I mean, I think that they had a gag, and once they discovered that gag, it was perfect.
Mm-hmm.
The kind of Dennis Wheatley lyrical content, the Devil's Interval, the use of the flattened fifth in the music. I mean, that, where would heavy metal be today without that?
Sure.
And they kind of ran with it. And it's one of those things where you start talking about Black Sabbath and you say, oh yeah, the first album. Well, actually the first 2. No, actually the first 3. No, it's the first 4. No, it's the first 5. Because they are creating the vocabulary of metal music through those albums.
Yeah, and again,
and it is a formula. And Ozzy's voice is this extraordinarily strange, unique thing.
Totally.
That just was perfect.
Well, he's as unique as Ferry and Bowie in his own way, because he's got a good voice, but he's almost like a distinctive non-singer in some ways, and all the better for it. I mean, I hear a kind of a nasal John Lennon quality in his voice sometimes.
But he's got he pitches really well, and he's got this beautiful melodies that come out of his,
I can't, I think he's a keep, again, once more. Every component of Black Sabbath is what makes it a great band.
But I mean, let's look at this album. This is an album that not only has things like Supernaut, quintessential Sabbath, riffage.
Yeah.
It also has changes.
Yeah.
It has Laguna's Sunrise on it. It's beautiful acoustic guitar and melody.
Changes is a great MOR ballad,
Absolutely. Yeah. So although they are seen as the godfathers of modern metal, there was so much more to them.
Well, again, this is why I bring it back to sort of Zeppelin and Purple. It's before these things have ossified into cliches.
Yes, yeah.
And yeah, you're right. They play with classical music. They do occasionally play with blues. They play with psychedelia, MOR balladry. This is not a one-trick pony band. And as I said, to me, it kind of comes together on Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath, and then Sabotage is the killer. I love the excess of the arrangements on that album. And of course, Symptom of the Universe, that's, for me, the definitive Black Sabbath track, really.
The definitive Black Sabbath riff, yeah. Well, actually, no, Black Sabbath is the definitive Black Sabbath riff. But yeah, in terms of the sort of modern metal sound, that's all there.
This does things that metal bands by 1979 are not doing.
Not capable of doing, to be fair. And I think, interestingly, when you listen to Tony Iommi's guitar style, there's a lot of very interesting chord voicings that have come from jazz. And come from musical forms that have nothing to do with heavy rock. And it's interesting because we talk about Jimmy Page in the same way, we talk about Ritchie Blackmore in the same way. And I think we talked about this in relation to progressive rock on a previous episode. I remember that each generation becomes slightly more reductive.
Yes.
So the first generation is always the more interesting because they're not simply influenced by what they sound like.
Yeah.
They're drawing on all these different things and creating a new hybrid. The second generation, by definition, is reductive because it's merely influenced by this already reductive form of influences. So they're influenced by the people that created the blueprint rather than creating the blueprint themselves, if that doesn't sound too convoluted as an argument.
Not at all, no.
And the same, I think, is very much true of heavy rock, isn't it? The modern heavy rock is basically cut from the cloth of Metallica, Sabbath, Iron Maiden, whereas original heavy rock came from jazz, blues, whatever,
Funk,
funk, classical music.
Iommi, great distinctive player, but I think wasn't that attributed partly because didn't he have his
he cut one of his fingers off.
in a factory accident? And I'm not sure whether he did draw on Django Reinhardt, but Django Reinhardt, of course, who famously had, I think, digits severely impaired by a fire in his caravan, developed his unique style through using his limitations. And I think Iommi also, maybe using this as inspiration, developed a unique style of playing the guitar. And one of the great Iommi stories, of course, is that he was in Jethro Tull very briefly.
Yeah, in fact, he's in Rock
before
and Roll
Martin
Circus.
Barr,
Yeah, the Rolling Stones film. So, talking about this kind of mixture of influences, apparently coming from nowhere and creating some new hybrid, Hawkwind.
Yeah.
Doremi, Fasol, Latido, one of my favorite bands of all time. Nominally space rock. Again, I think a bit like Sabbath, they found a gag early on, and it was to tap into the kind of sci-fi. Bob Calvert came up with a lot of those lyrics early on. Also, the Barney Bubbles artwork.
Yeah.
Tapping into a lot of sci-fi. And of course, sci-fi was very big at the time.
Yeah.
People were fascinated by space.
And Michael Moorcock was involved with him at some point.
Michael Moorcock was involved, yeah, absolutely. So tapping into that kind of fascination people had with space travel. We just landed on the moon for the first time a few years earlier. It's very much capturing the zeitgeist of people's fascination with space. And there's something I love about Hawkwind that also, you talked about the Stooges earlier and the Velvet Underground. They've got that primitivism as well about them, haven't they? They've got that punk rock aesthetic, even though the music in conception is as grand and pretentious as anything that Pink Floyd are doing. It doesn't have the same degree of musicianship, but it's got a lot of the same tropes, a lot of the same spacey imagery. The artwork is always very elaborate. The songs can be quite long. The musicianship is much more limited, but I think that in a sense becomes, perhaps in the same way, that we talk about Eno being a non-musician, about it being the ideas, not the execution. There's a lot of that going on in Hawkwind too, isn't there?
There is, and I think one other kind of unacknowledged element is that there's a parallel between Hawkwind and Krautrock.
Yes.
In their relentlessness,
yes.
I think. And you're right. And maybe in their case, it's because of musical limitations, but there is a relentlessness in which it follows one idea through and through and through and through.
Repetition.
Totally.
Repetition. Nothing clever, just repetition.
But really imaginative sonically, the use of synth textures, and not afraid again. This is not just a kind of bombardment, because there are always lovely kind of acoustic ballads that come out of this, or ambient interludes, even at this stage, In Search of Space and Doremi. There are levels to this music. And in fact, one of the sweetest tracks is written by Lemmy and sung by Lemmy, which is quite peculiar. Lemmy, who then goes on, obviously, to Motorhead later. What's great about Hawkwind is you can see why somebody who loves progressive rock loves their ambition and their generic blurring of boundaries, how somebody who is a punk rocker finds a total energy and focus of rhythmic purpose in the
there's
music.
A kind of primal non-musician
there is a primal
energy to it.
Yeah. So they can kind of appeal on many different levels. And I think that, from In Search of Space, really right through the 70s, they changed as well, because, by the mid-70s, they're making slightly more composed, Mellotron-dominated albums. By the time Calvert rejoined in the late 70s, they're making amazing post-punk albums.
New wave records. Yeah, absolutely. I absolutely adore Hawkwind. This album is part of a continuum of albums. Again, I would say the album before this, In Search of Space, the one after, Hall of Mountain Grill, slightly better for me.
Yeah,
but Doremi has some of their definitives at Brainstorm, Space is Deep, Time We Left the World Today, Lord of Light, brilliant brilliant songs.
And there's a sense of musicians getting lost in that sound. You know, one of the
Yeah.
things we were talking about earlier about whether it's Mark Almond or Nick Drake being lost in their own world, but then bands like Deep Purple being lost. And of course the Kraut Rockers, you know. You've got this with Hawkwind, that they are lost in this blur of sound.
Well, I think so. I was going to use the word otherness again, a word I use quite often, to be fair, but I think it applies here equally. There's something about Hawkwind that defies analysis. Just the sound it has this strange, which kind of immediately, you know, straight away that kind of gels in with the whole space concept. It sounds like music beaming in from another cosmos.
Yeah.
It's a very, very surreal soup, a kind of, again, gestalt thing, this kind of soup of sound. And if you analyze it too closely, I mean, I did remix a couple of their albums, and it's a mistake to go in and listen to things in solo because the musicianship is not great. And even some of the recording quality is not great. In fact, Doremi is an album I would dearly have loved to remix. The master tapes apparently are missing, but multi-track tapes are missing because it's quite lo-fi and I think it could sound better. But at the same time, I'm also saying to myself, but you might spoil what's special about it by cleaning it up too much.
There's an accidental quality, and you're right, there is a very soupy quality about this music. And it also, you know, it has comparisons with krautrock. It has comparisons with post-rock as well, I think, in some ways.
And obviously a big influence on, again, we put it in the heavy rock category. There is a big influence on modern metal and stuff as well.
Yeah.
Interesting, you mentioned the connection to bands like Neu. Andrew Lauder from United Artists. These are all bands he signed. He signed Hawkwind, he signed Neu, he signed Can. He signed Amondil too. So actually, he also signed Brinsley Schwartz and a few other British bands. But in terms of the bands we kind of remember as being on United Artists, it's Hawkwind and the krautrock bands.
Yeah.
They are the bands we most remember being on United Artists. And the Groundhogs actually as well. Groundhogs made 2 albums this year. Who Will Save the World and Hogwash. Are you familiar with Groundhogs, Tim?
Yeah.
I really like them. I really like them. They're quite odd, quite unique. I don't even know where to begin to describe them. So you have a go, Tim.
Well, I think that they're a band who come out of the blues boom like Fleetwood Mac and quite a number of others, and clearly there are strong blues influences. So it's like a band who haven't jettisoned their influences, but they've totally embraced the ambitious progressive idea that's floating in the air in 1972. So these are almost like progressive blues albums because they're really ambitious at times. Yeah, there's the use of mellotron. I think he's a very early adopter of guitar synths as well.
I think Tony McPhee was always fascinated by technology, yeah.
And I love that he's kind of, he's as rooted to Robert Johnson as he is trying to find the future of music.
Yeah.
And it is quite raw, quite uncompromising, quite unpretentious. But yeah, they go off at some wild tangents. And I think I'd probably go for Who Will Save the World as my favourite of these 2 albums. But they're really interesting.
I love Split, the album from the year before. Cherry Red, that track is just such a classic. Yeah, what a great riff.
But isn't it that, you know, we're talking about the progressive era, you know, so if Babacom Lee is what happens when a folk artist, you know, a folk artist embraces rock and progressive, this is what happens when a blues artist embraces progressive.
So now we've talked about this before, I think. In fact, you brought it up, I think, on a previous episode, that there's sometimes in certain eras, there is a prevailing spirit that comes from one direction that affects every genre. Maybe we talked about it in the late 70s, how punk and new wave was kind of affecting everything, whether directly and indirectly. Is it fair to say that in 1972, progressive ideals are affecting everything from soul music to heavy rock music to folk music?
As it did, you know, later as well. I think, you know, by the time you get to 76 and people like Stevie Wonder are embracing it, you know, I think, it's in the air. There are ideas in the air. But to me, what's kind of interesting is, I guess things like Babacom Lee and Who Will Save the World, they're almost like these stillborn directions, these fascinating offshoots that never properly took off as genres, but could equally have taken off because they're very strong records, you know? But yeah, you're right. I think there is, you know, in 72, although, you know, people like Sinatra, I think he has his comeback album in 73 actually, but people like Sinatra had always thought in conceptual terms. yeah, the country artists are thinking in conceptual terms and more ambitious song cycles. So there is something in the air. I'd say it's kind of post-psychedelic, but equally,
I think we
there's that
talked about.
return to rock and roll, isn't there?
I think we talked about on the psychedelic episode. We talked
Yeah,
about how psychedelia was kind of indirectly affecting
yeah, almost
everything else.
everything.
Everything else, almost everything. Yeah,
Yeah.
from country artists to soul artists to funk. There's a little bit of psych creeping in, and maybe that's true this year too. There's a little bit of that progressive sensibility where we're in a serious albums band, you know, longer, more extended pieces, more use of technology, more use of the studio as a kind of instrument for
Well,
processing and
also
mutating
wanting to
sound.
push themselves, not relying on
Concept albums.
reputation
Yeah.
and so on.
So a few other heavy rock albums from this. Quo, Piledriver, love Quo. Love the whole series of 70s Quo albums. Piledriver, Paper Plane, great track. Big Fat Mama, great track. Roadhouse Blues, one of the best Quo albums. What can you say about Quo, Tim? You a fan?
Not really.
No, okay. Fuck you then. Thin Lizzy, Shades of a Blue Orphanage. Was that their first album?
Second.
Second album. They're quite interesting, those early. I haven't heard them for a while, but
I love them. Well, they are one of those bands.
Pre-twin leads, isn't it? It's
Yeah.
just the one guitar. Eric Bell at the time, yeah.
And the title track is something like 8 minutes long.
Oh, it must be good then.
Has a mellotron.
It must be good. Is Cloder on one of these albums?
Cloder plays mellotron on
There
it.
you go.
Cloder Simmons.
Yeah.
I think it's brilliant. I mean, I think I love the first two Thin Lizzy albums. This might be my favourite because again, this is where do they go? They're coming out of folk as much as they're coming out of hard rock. So you might be able to hear Van Morrison, Peter Green, all sorts of things in the background. And it's a kind of a stew of unusual influences put together in quite an ambitious way. And you don't know how they're going to come out. At this point, you don't know where Lizzy are going to go.
Neither do they.
And neither do they, but Lynyrt's still got his great voice. Eric Bell's a really interesting guitarist. I really like them this period, partly because there's something amorphous and undecided. And they come into my category of the underrated, you know, my league of the underrated, where if Thin Lizzy had only done these first two albums, we'd still be talking about this great lost Irish band. What the hell happened?
Right.
They could have been huge because it's there, the blueprint for greatness, I think.
Other albums we've got in this category: Free at Last, ZZ Top, Rio Grande Mud, Sensational Alex Harvey Band, Framed, Alice Cooper Schools Out. Apparently we've got a review, listener review of Alice Cooper Schools Out. So let's let the listener review this one. Here we go.
Hello, my name is Zachary Nathanson, and my choice for 1972 is Alice Cooper's 1972 classic, Schools Out. The original lineup of the band brought in elements of Leonard Bernstein, glam, proto-punk, A Clockwork Orange, and Life After Graduating. Alice was on top during that time frame, and what an album it was to follow up with their previous release, Killer. It is hard rock at its finest.
Fantastic review. Nothing to add to that, Tim? You got anything to add to that?
No, I think he's right. And I think I mean, I really love the production on those albums and the ambition and the fact that Alice Cooper, again, he's not a hard rock comic book character that people perceive him. You know, you do get things from West Side Story. You do get great Beatles pop melodies. You do get a great hard rock band. And of course, they were signed originally, I think, to Zappa, or the label that was run by Zappa as a manager, weren't they? Herb Cohen, I think. They're actually a really interesting band with a great knack for killer choruses. But there's always ambition. And of course, you know, Alice Cooper did a number of sort of conceptually oriented works after this. You know, he's a little like Gabriel, a little like Bowie. He's a clever guy playing characters, but making great music through playing characters. And I think it was Bob Ezrin's, along with, you know, Berlin, Lou Reed, he did around this time as well. You know, some of his early productions with Cooper. I love Bob Ezrin's work on this, and it's why he came to attention.
Okay, there we go, folks. That's Tim having nothing to add. Okay,